This is Ian Williams from the Foreign Press Association of New York, and it gives me a great deal of pleasure today to welcome our guest Fron Nahzi, who is with the McCain Institute as a senior fellow on global development. Fron has been involved in the Balkans for many, many years. We have written about it together and we've plotted its vicissitudes in different ways. But Fron has always been extraordinarily good on the sort of the Albanian nexus. That's Kosovo, Macedonia, Bosnia, and of course the border areas. And this is the particular delight of the current situation that we're talking about. Now, as I understand it, the Trump administration has gone to a great deal of effort to broker a peace in a part of the world that most people know nothing about. Most Americans couldn't point to Asia on the map. They certainly couldn't point to Albania. Even fewer could point to Kosovo. So why is this so important for the Trump administration that they brokered a deal that got mutual recognition between Israel and Kosovo? But I understand it's a, how should we say, a phony deal with Serbia. Serbia has just promised to stop being nasty for 12 months. Is that a fair summary?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to the Foreign Press. For most of us, we've known Ian now for more than 25 years. When we started, I think I had almost as much as here as Ian, but time. So I lived and worked in the Balkans for more than 25 years. And so everything in the Balkans is like a three-tier chess game. And unfortunately, it's always the Balkans who lose at the end. And this current agreement that you're referring to was put together very quickly. And both Belgrade and Serbia didn't really see the terms of the agreement until they got to Washington. When it did get to Washington, D.C., they found that it listed everything there from, building of railways, building highways between Belgrade and Pristina, to having flights between Belgrade and Pristina, which ironically, Serbia does not recognize Kosovo's passports. I don't know how that's going to work. And then they included the rights of homosexuals. They included the record not to recognize Hezbollah, to make sure not to work with anything that's 5G or China related. And the last but not last piece was that Kosovo and Israel would recognize it. So it was a very unusual agreement. It was only between Belgrade and Pristina with no enforcement mechanisms. And when both Belgrade and Pristina left Washington, D.C. on September 15th, the way after the agreement, Trump and his administration sold it as a great victory for their constituents, especially in the states where you have a Jewish community, Florida for that matter, Pennsylvania. We're saying, here's another Muslim state, meaning Kosovo, who's just recognized Israel and is willing to move its embassy to Jerusalem, which is a great thing for Kosovo that Israel recognizes it. As you know, 99.9% of the Americans have no idea where Kosovo is. But I think the spin there was that they perceived it as a Muslim state. Now, the other key factor here is that you do have a very large Albanian American community, especially the Kosovar community in Michigan, which according to them, the Michigan Albanian chapter claims that they have 32,000 registered voters. And the Trump administration has been courting them for some time. Vice President Pence went there, met with them, and he asked them, what are your concerns? And they raised the Kosovo issue. And they were extremely satisfied with this agreement, thinking that all this funding will go to the Kosovo. And the other part was that no partition took place. So from the United States point of view, they feel like, or Trump's point of view, he's gave something to the Albanian Americans in Michigan. And keep in mind, like everybody knows, Michigan was won by only about 10,000 votes in the last elections. And he also gave something and beefed up his whole platform, that what he's doing in regard to the Jewish constituency in the US, especially when it comes to vis-a-vis Israel.
And I mean, this idea that they were presented with this deal, that they weren't involved in negotiating it, it looks like a group of fans in the White House got together and put their shopping list in, you know, or their wish list, and sent it over to both of them and told them, you know, sign here.
Actually, that's pretty accurate. I mean, you know, you have also, you know, Ambassador Grinnell, who,
hence the gay part, probably.
well, I'm not sure about that, but, you know, I mean, he was in Germany, and we know what he's did, and he had no knowledge of the Balkans and came into it. Now there's a second part of this. The original idea was, in fact, to have Hashim Thaçi, the president and the former leader of the Kosovo Liberation Army, along with Vučić, which was to come to Washington, D.C. This was about
Serbia. We should
right. Vučić, the president of Serbia, to come together in Washington, D.C. to sign some kind of agreement. We still didn't know what that agreement was. At that time, most people thought that that agreement meant the swapping of territory, which is something that both Vučić and Thaçi were playing around with. Now, Thaçi's interest there was hoping that he can win some points with the current Trump administration in the hope that they could play a role in trying to stop the Hague prosecution that's coming down the pipeline regarding crimes committed after the war. For those of you, you know, familiar with it, approximately 400 people or so went missing after the conflict ended in Kosovo, and Thaçi and a lot of the leaders have been accused of having a role in the missing.
Now, the territorial deal, this would be a swap of the currently Serb-dominated area around Mitrovica and what is it?
Preševo Valley.
Yes, which is predominantly Albanian. So,
correct.
And Thaçi was okay with that deal?
That was being toyed around for some time. And again, Thaçi is a person who's always looked to see how he could benefit and continue his political domination of that. So he's been in power now for almost 20-something years, and obviously accused of tremendous amount of corruption. So his idea was, how do I maintain? Now, the biggest fear that the KLA, the former Kosovo Liberation Army, have is obviously the indictments that are expected this year to come down against the leadership. On the other hand, the Kosovars, the ethnic Albanians, are hoping that the court, the Hague court, does what's something that the international community cannot do, which is cleanse Kosovo. I use that in a different sense, of these corrupt oligarchs that have been controlling Kosovo since after the war in 1999.
And what about, I mean, there were shenanigans just before this when basically it would appear that the US contrived the dismissal of the Kosovo prime minister because he wasn't playing ball with them. Was this specifically related to this, or was it? It was,
yeah. It's actually, you know, again, when I said in the beginning, it's a three-tier chess game and it keeps going down. And so one of the things that Kosovo faces now is that for the first time they have a new party called Self-Determination, run by a young man by the name of Albin Kurti, 40-something years old, who was part of the Kosovo liberation movement, was imprisoned by Serbia during the war, and in fact is a person who changed his personality to fit the needs of his constituency in Kosovo. And at the moment, Albin's party refuses to recognize Thaçi, refuses even to recognize the current leadership, and is polling somewhere at about 50% or above what they expect in the next election, which would give them the necessary majority. Now, Albin has also done something else which is very unusual. He's also has not taken or followed the United States blindly like the previous leaders of the from the Albanian side, either Thaçi or the other parties. He's been very critical of Grinnell, very critical of the U.S. He hasn't held back. He wants to make sure that any agreements are done with Serbia are done actually first mutual recognition, and then we'll do agreements. And he has a point there. For example, how could you have a railroad system, a transportation system, when Serbia refuses to recognize the neighbor's passports? And there you had a game by the US government that many claim where Albin was being difficult and refused to actually even think about the kind of agreement right now that we're discussing. And United States came out, and according to the accusations, One is they stopped the Millennium Challenge Corporation Fund, which was a $50 million pot of money the U.S. gave to Kosovo for economic development. They also threatened to withdraw the U.S. troops from Kosovo. There are approximately about 2,000 to 9,000 troops right now in Kosovo. And all this led to, in a sense, of bringing down Albin Kurti's government after 2-3 months. And it worked brilliantly. And the other parties came out and accused him of saying, look, to the general public, we need to bring him down because he's anti-American. And as you know very well, if you go to Pristina, most of the roads are named after Clinton, Bush, Tony Blair. There are statues of all sorts of, Westerners, in particular the Americans. So that was a really easy PR stunt, which led to the current agreement and allowing Trump to do what he's doing now.
And this gets even more complicated because, as you said, the recognition with Israel is nice, but this deal is almost very reminiscent of what the Palestinians signed at Oslo, where the Palestinians gave away their bargaining card, which was recognition by the Arab world, in return for promises that maybe down the line we'll consider coming to an agreement. So there are parallels here, even though I don't think they were on the minds of the negotiators. Well,
the thing that most of us were quite concerned about was that the deal from the beginning was that the Americans would end the war and the Europeans would keep the peace. Now, in all fairness, the Europeans really haven't been holding up to this sort of part of the agreement, especially finding some kind of solution to this knot between Serbia and Kosovo. And in fact, most of us welcome U.S. re-engagement into the area in the hope that we would hold both Belgrade and Pristina sort of accountable and come to some kind of deal. Now, as far as Israel is concerned, as I said earlier, it's actually very important for Kosovo to have Israel's recognition. The more countries it gets, the better. Obviously, still, as you know, many of the European countries refuse to recognize Kosovo. So now the other part of this, as far as the promise of the funding, these are loans that are supposed to go to Kosovo and Serbia for the construction of these major highways, linking Belgrade and all the way down to, it'll go all the way down to the southern part of Albania. If you look at that agreement, there's two parts to it. One is it's a loan, and the second one is that do you have the capacity to manage a multi-billion-dollar loan? Kosovo does not. Kosovo only has a very small part of that road construction, and they don't have the large enterprises. So that's probably going to go to a foreign company like Bechtel, who's been developing roads in that region for a long time. Serbia does actually have the capacity to manage such huge funds, and they do have the construction companies. So out of the deal, I would say that Serbia came ahead without actually giving anything away. And Vucic has proven to be extraordinarily cunning. Not only does he also keep Putin happy, not only does he also keep the Europeans guessing, but he's also now gotten money from the Americans. Meanwhile, without going too much in detail about Serbia, his record on journalists, as far as attacking journalists and human rights, is deplorable, and yet he still gets away with it. Well, there's a long record of that. If we just looking at it again from the Israel-Kosovo angle, which was the headline to some extent here. So Kosovo, it gets recognition from another country, and obviously a diplomatically important and influential country in the friends it wants to make, like in Europe. But I mean, most of the countries that don't recognize Kosovo in Europe, it's not necessarily because they like the Serbs, it's because they have their own angles. Like the Spanish don't want to recognize a breakaway enclave in case people think, Catalonia next. There's similar sort of drawbacks of people with possible secessionist movements that might be encouraged by this. It's not because of love of Serbia. And then when you come to Israel, what did the Israelis get recognition from a country in the Balkans? And it's okay, it's supposedly a Muslim country, although it's
dubiously so, but you might want to come back to that afterwards, because this might actually make it more Muslim than it was before I got there.
Well, the one thing, historically speaking, now, and again, just for the record, I am an ethnic Albanian. If I sound that I'm sort of, being a little bit nationalistic, please don't take it that way. The Albanians do have a record of actually protecting the Serbs, especially in Albania proper. Now, that said, you also had the Albanian Fascist Party that was part of, Hitler. Now, in the actual agreement, there is actually a line in there that they said they must protect and give back the Jewish property. And now, when I read that, I kind of chuckled. Everybody's trying to get their property back, which is another issue in itself. Now, as far as Albania is concerned, I think it's also the perception of the fact that if you have the United States and Israel on your side, you can be a little bit more critical of the Europeans. And that sort of has been the perception among the Albanians. I'm not talking about the rest of the Balkan countries. At the same time, I can't say there's been a tremendous amount of investments by Israel in either Albania or Kosovo, but I think it's more about the political aspect of it. Now, as far as, investments are concerned, what they should be looking at close is obviously Turkey's role, especially what they're doing in there right now, China, what they're doing in there, and to what extent this agreement is going to change what Vučić has been doing in Serbia and the amount of money he's getting. And is this a competition between the United States to counter China's influence? So that really is, for me, sort of where the big issue is. The recognition of Israel is great. It works really well for Trump here. I'm not sure how it's going to play and lend to what Kosovo is going to do for economics.
But Kosovo as well, it now, won't it lose as much as it gains? Because it was already trying hard to get non-aligned and Muslim support before, and some of the Muslim countries were shared my skepticism about its Islamicity. So they went knee-jerk supporters of Kosovo. So wouldn't this agreement alienate as many countries as it befriends?
I think, the one thing that the Kosovars have always done is identifying themselves very much as Europeans. Now, keep in mind, there's a very large immigrant community, especially in Switzerland and elsewhere. Some of your best, famous soccer players right now, Kosovars playing in some of these Manchester United and elsewhere. So they identify themselves quite with European. I think the issue is not the fact that they're going to lose any sort of alliance with the Arab or the Muslim states, because they're not really gaining too much in economic incentives for that, except for the building of mosques. They saw that and got rid of them, especially when Saudi Arabia was there right after the war. They said, that's all you're going to give us is mosques. We don't need it. Thank you very much. I think here the player is Turkey, who tends to play both hands, the religious card and also the economic card. The economic card is it benefits Erdogan directly in his family. And this, everything he does, obviously, is for himself. I think the issue here is less about what the Kosovo's relationships with the Muslims and more about its relationship right now, which is, I think, very dangerous regarding the United States. And what I mean by this is that if Albin Kurti and his party's self-determination win the elections next year, which they have the potential, they would benefit if they want from this agreement. They can also just do away with it. But unfortunately, one of the things that we've seen is that for the first time, you see the youth absolutely exhausted, even by the Americans, of protecting these oligarchs, these corrupt officials. And that's the way this was viewed. This was viewed as the Americans saying, by a lot of the youth saying, this was an opportunity really for America to glow, but it didn't do anything for us because the same corrupt officials are there in place, and the same corrupt officials will benefit from these $1 billion investments, which we witnessed for the last 20-something years. And so I think next year, when the elections take place, you're going to see, I think, a little bit of people saying that we want to throw these guys out, even though maybe the United States probably like them for their own personal reasons. And and Albin has not been hesitant to say that he'll take a much more independent position, not only against, obviously, U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis Kosovo, but also some of the European states as well.
How will that play out? I mean, is there a percentage for Kosovo in sticking your finger to Trump? If Trump loses, will the incoming foreign policy team say thank you very much for putting the finger up Trump's nose and Rick Grenell's nose and Pompeo's nose?
Well, it's the one thing that, look, United States has been the USAID, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the United States has put a tremendous amount of money in there. The United States continuously is still very popular. And sometimes even though, the fact that even if the US even donates $1 to Kosovo, I think as long as it continues to play that honest broker, they will continue to have the support. Now, it would be great actually for more economic development to come in there. Now, Kosovo is, has right now become a captured state. We have to call it what it is. It's a mafia-run state. And the Kosovars are frustrated not only with the Americans, but more so with the Europeans, who are responsible for maintaining the rule of law under this very complex system that happened called the European the EU, ULEX rule of law system that I was responsible for supposedly indicting some of these corrupt officials. So, I think there's a lot of frustration taking place here. And I'm afraid that United States, by taking the position they did, by backing Hashim Thaci, for example, and taking out Albin, might have pushed more people saying that, look, we can't even, I can't say majority, but a good proportion of people within Albin's party saying, look, even United States is not a fair player in this game.
While I'm looking, is there anybody out there who would like to ask a question from Fron? Please tap it in if you do on the chat screen, and we can take it up from there. By the way, I've never quite understood the total affection for the Americans there, because to give him his due, he's not my hero, but it was Blair and the Europeans who actually moved for physical military interference in Kosovo when Clinton was holding back on it. But he managed to get all the glory for liberation without actually risking a soldier that the Republicans could point to him for.
Well, I mean, Ahtisaari made a statement which I think rung true. You're absolutely right. You can say Tony Blair, but Ahtisaari, once he found a settlement between Belgrade and Pristina, he made a statement saying, look, he says, the only way to resolve conflict is if the United States gets involved. Mm. And that sort of summarizes, and I think that's sort of the perception, or it's the reality that most people in the Balkans have even today. If you go to Bosnia, if you go anywhere out of these places, a lot of places, they would say, look, at least with the Americans, they came in, at least they pushed the agenda, at least they pushed things forward. Where the Europeans were dealing with their own personal problems of all these various states, unfortunately, quite often, they find themselves at a sort of, at a very slow pace, more discussion and less action, let me put it that way.
Yeah, well, that takes the European Union, European Commission takes 2 years to agree whether to have sugar in the coffee or not, because anybody can veto it. It's a very difficult way. But the US is the Albanians and the Bosnians look at the US as a sort of backstop to keep the Serbs out, don't they? As much, it's not just the economic aid. It's that if the crunch comes and the Serbs decided to kick up militarily, the US would stop them, I think is the feeling. Am I right?
I think it's part of that. I think if that was probably 10 years ago, I think right now, the one thing that I think most people have in common in the region is how do we stop this continuous, how do I say, power grab by these oligarchs, the capture state. If you ask most people in Serbia, Bosnia, Kosovo, Albania, it's really corruption keeps coming up, and it's the same people. And as far as, you're right, the only country that could counter Russia and sort of Serbia's any sort of ambition they may have to continue its expansion, most people would see as the United States as being the protector of that. Historically speaking, it plays into that. So yes, a very short answer is yes, the United States is still seen as the guardian of the current status, whatever that means. And just as a reminder, you know, the Daytona Accords were pushed by the Americans, whatever you may think about them.
I wouldn't. We don't have time to talk about the
So
Dayton.
you want to sort of skip that, but I got a question here from Edna Perkins.
Okay, go for it then. What?
This is the post-pandemic. How do you suppose it would be that? Yeah, no, that's well. The thing is, I mean, one question, that question really almost makes the assumption that there were actually a lot of industries in the region. There weren't, unfortunately. So you had the unemployment rate in Kosovo was extremely high. I mean, it's anywhere between 28 to 30%, especially among those under the age of 35. And there was actually a lack of real, you know, small, medium, or large enterprises. So right now you have a lot of frustration. A lot of the youth throughout the region, especially in Albania and Kosovo and elsewhere, are looking to go to the West because there's lack of employment opportunities. Most of the people survive on remittances that are coming from families. They have family members either in Switzerland, Germany mostly, and in the UK. If it wasn't for the remittance, I think you would have a serious collapse, meaning as far as the way the state would function if it wasn't for the remittance that are coming in. I don't know exact number what is that, but I know it's extremely high.
And as you said, the corruption as well. If it's the mafia state, there's the how much is it suggested the sort of laundered money gets in there or comes through the area?
Well, you know, I think that really is. And look, I'll go back to this guy, Albin Kurti, who's running his party. And he's got over 50% or more, which is unusual because most of these parties usually get between, you know, 28 to 32%, 35, let's say. And he's run on this campaign of saying that you vote for me, I will get rid of corruption. And he's kept his party quite clean. And he himself has actually has been very careful not to take any money from any kind of sources that might change, you know, his the perceptions people have of him. And he's done something else. He's called the leaders out on their corruption, which is something very unusual for someone who was, you know, for 3 months a prime minister and someone who will probably become prime minister. And one of the things that he did immediately upon his taking office, he started cleaning house very quickly, getting rid of some of the corrupt officials. And that really helped his reputation as someone who's willing actually to be very proactive. Now, I mean, saying all these good things about him, on the other hand, he actually has a habit of some extremist view. And he's been very good at everything from a very liberal ideology, if you want to call it a social democratic with nationalist tendency. He calls for a great Albania, doesn't want to recognize some of the agreements made because they were made under, especially when it comes to the Serbs. So there are, you know, there's a lot there that could potentially push the region back into some kind of potential, let's say, not conflict, but raise the stress level.
Yeah. There's a question. It got a bit garbled. I thought it was in Albanian for a moment. Was Albanian Prime Minister Edi Rama involved in land swaps?
Yeah, you know, that's a really good question. So, you know, I think he was, because he was actually, you know, he was involved in initial discussion between Vučić, and he went to Belgrade and they had discussions, and there was, you know, and he was trying to become sort of the voice, a reason for the region, you know, saying that, you know, we can find some kind of agreement. And one of the agreements obviously was there with Vučić and Hashim Thaçi. By the way, that's the only person that Edi Rama has in Kosovo that's willing to talk to him. The other parties refused to speak to Edi Rama. In fact, Edi Rama was almost voted as persona non grata because of positions that he took without asking the Kosovars. So there is actually ample evidence that he was involved and backed away and then let Thaçi and Vučić run with it. So short answer is yes, he was definitely, in my opinion, involved. I also spoke to some of the people that were on the inside. Like most Balkan leaders, they thought this might lead to a Nobel Peace Prize, which is not unusual. Everybody thinks they're going to get the Nobel Peace Prize. Ian's been thinking he's going to get the Nobel Peace Prize since I've known him. So anyway.
But this is when we put this all together. So the Albanian Prime Minister isn't speaking to the Kosovars, and they're both prepared to hand over to accept part of Serbia with an Albanian majority. Whatever happened to the great fears that were raised at the time by the Serbian nationalists about Greater Albania, which they assumed was axiomatically a bad thing? I take it that's off the agenda now.
Well, I mean, look, there is also the discussion that, on the table, and the Serbs continue to raise it, that there is a possibility of a Great Albania. Now, as I said, Albin Kurti has not held back on a Greater Albania. Let me just answer that question this way. So what he's done with his own movement, he's actually started a movement now in Albania also. He's also started the same movement in Macedonia. He's doing one in Montenegro. And in fact, he also has a movement here in the United States, which I don't know why, but he does. And the movement actually makes it very clear what the objective is actually to create the Greater Albania. Now, where that begins and ends, I don't know. So he actually represents that more so than anyone else at the moment. Everyone tries to play the nationalist card. And this is where United States and Europeans have come often and told both the Albanians, who rely on them for tremendous amount of aid, back off. And they have actually, from Berisha to Edi Rama, every time they use that, Albania is a different kind of person, in a sense, a political animal. He's willing to play that card and hasn't held back on it. Is it going to happen? I have no idea. I really don't. Would it lead to conflict? I think it definitely would. And this is where I go back to what I said earlier. It's the first time that since the fall of communism that you have an Albanian leader critical of the U.S., which is very unusual for the Albanians. It was a taboo to say anything bad about the Americans. I'll just give you this sort of anecdote. While I was working in Kosovo right after the war, a U.S. soldier raped an Albanian girl. The father refused to bring the soldier to court or to testify against him because he felt as though he was going to testify against the United States. It was the most macabre, bizarre situation that people kind of said, this love for the United States is
which would, under normal circumstances, provoke an everlasting blood feud.
Yeah, exactly.
So if Greater Albania is off the table, you mentioned before about Turkey, and we'll come back to it. But one of the reasons that was adduced at the time for NATO and the West getting involved was the sort of Balkan spillover effect. If refugees started going and the Serbs took action against them, then the Turks might get involved. If the Turks get involved, the Greeks get involved. If the Greeks get involved, the Russians get involved. And bingo, World War III, straight back to Sarajevo the first time round. Is that type of thinking still about? That if the Turks, who interestingly show a lot less enthusiasm for the Muslims in the Uyghurs in Xinjiang in China than they do for the Muslim brothers in the Balkans at the moment.
So I think that game is a little bit sort of been exposed. And we're seeing that a lot of these political leaders have used the veil of nationalism to push their own personal economic agendas. And from Putin to Erdogan to most of these Balkan leaders, they'll use it when they need it or hide behind the veil of that. At the moment, as we know very well, I mean, you have Greece and Turkey almost about ready to go to war. You have two NATO countries about to go to war. And the only person in between is Edi Rama, the Prime Minister of Albania, who also is a NATO member, just for everybody's information, which is just fascinating in that sense of where's everybody else and what in the world is going on.
To quote Stalin, how many divisions does Edi Rama have if the war breaks out?
Is this whole thing between sort of the Orthodox alliance versus the Muslim alliance, I think it was a very 90s, perception. I think really right now, most of us who watch the Balkans look at more about the business interest between the leaders and how does that come to play. Why does Erdogan, for example, is welcome in Belgrade the same way he's welcome in Pristina, the same way he was welcome in Tirana? Yeah. He just built a whole airport, and Lord knows in Tirana, and also he's built a lot of stuff in now. So it's really, in a sense, I hate to say, it's become sort of like less about what we thought geopolitically, and more about really these very sort of, let's say, personal opportunities, financial opportunities that just that drive a lot of these relationships. I seriously doubt that Turkey has an interest in Kosovo as a political, vested interest. I mean, Kosovo doesn't give much to it. But if, did it invest there? A little bit. It invested mostly in Albania and Serbia, where in fact there's more opportunities.
As you were talking about the economic interests, I was thinking back to the good old days of the original war in Kosovo, where people who I personally considered deranged leftists proved with maps and diagrams it was all about pipelines. Every pipeline in the area was going to go through Kosovo, and that was what the war was about. Has anyone built a pipeline? Has anyone got any interest in building one? Just for the record.
They are. Actually, the pipeline is being built from Baku all the way through Albania. British Petroleum and others are involved. So you do have that gas pipeline, which will go off to Italy. That's taking place. So there is. And the nice thing about that, it's also exposing there's a lot of archaeological sites that are being discovered, so there's a positive aspect of that as well. So that is taking place. Kosovo, in the middle of all this geopolitical or regional kind of game, is really just a place in transit. It's things where people will pass through. It's doubtful that it's going to attract tremendous amount of investments of all these roads and railroads. It's unfortunate. The reason for that is because it's shot itself a little bit in the foot because of being a captured state or a mafia state, as I said earlier. Now, there are a few opportunities there for investment, but not that many that would attract the kind of, Western Europeans or American firms to it. As far as the oil, gas, Kosovo actually, relies on coal right now for its energy. There is talk about, more sustainable, energy developments. But again, it's a lot of discussion, but nothing major of that kind of pipeline that you were talking about. We haven't seen or doubt we're going to see anything going through Kosovo.
Mm-hmm. Simon Locke was looking at
I saw that.
The president's policy has been transactional, he describes it. Namely, Trump has got this deal together because he thinks he's going to get something out of it.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, he's put it in there. He's got the eternal gratitude from Benjamin Netanyahu, but how much more eternal gratitude can he get from Netanyahu? So what's in it for him? Is there a serious chance that these 38,000 alleged Albanian votes will turn up in Michigan?
I'm not sure to be 38, but I think he'll get 10,000.
Wouldn't they? I mean, don't they tend to be Republican anyway? Will they tend to? I mean, it's the extra votes which count in this circumstance, isn't it?
Right. So it's a really good question. Now, I mean, the agreement is actually, again, if you haven't seen it, you should get a hold of it because it's a fascinating agreement. As I said earlier on, it includes everything in there. And if anybody's involved in elections, they'll know that it was built in such a way to gain as many domestic, meaning US points as possible, depending on the various groups that you're targeting for your election campaign. It is, from the 5G to, as I said, the rights of the gay community. And I mean, it's like everything's in there, plus, foreign investment in the region in the sense of loans. The chances of that agreement really being implemented, which we expect elections next year, are quite slim. So it's doubtful that because the agreement is only between Belgrade and Pristina, and the United States has made that very clear, and they're responsible for implementing it. There are no mechanisms to hold them accountable to this agreement. So the benefit is short-term in the sense of for this election, and in Michigan in particular, maybe Ohio, where I hear there's also a large Serb community, when they find out that Vučić and Serbia will get $12 billion in loans, let me make that clear, maybe that would persuade. But I know in Michigan, I think that's going to be quite key. Now, as far as Albanian American community is concerned, they did write in its public letter to Trump saying that they have 1 million registered voters, and if he does act on Kosovo, that he could, these guys, a wing kind of would support, because that is such a huge issue and a priority for them. I doubt there are 1 million Albanian Americans in the United States. Just for the record, I think there's about 250,300 according to Harvard University study. But there is that kind of enthusiasm for it, that the United States is returning back to. Now, the last part about this is that they also feel that Trump is going back and trying to clean up the mess left behind by Clinton and the Democrats. So there is that part of it as well, but which he's trying to sell to some people, but it's not as high as saying that, look, you have a Muslim state that just recognizes Israel. And I'll stop here for 1 second. And the reason why this is important is because right after the agreement, that's the first thing that Trump tweeted to the public, is that Kosovo recognized Israel. And it's another Muslim state that's willing to relocate, didn't even have an embassy, to locate the embassy to Jerusalem.
So they're quite prepared to move a non-existent embassy from one part of the city to another. It's, I mean, this really is shadow box, three-dimensional shadow boxing almost.
Yeah, but to Simon's point, I think I think this is a really short-term beneficial to Trump more so than the region. Only because the current government is very weak, it will collapse. The next government is made very clear, meaning the one by Albin Kurti, will not recognize this agreement. So I think we're not going to see this next year.
Would Serb Americans, how would they react to a deal that involved them handing over part of Serbia, even if it is a majority Albanian one?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Brilliant about these things.
It's a really good question. I mean, I can't really judge that. One is because I was really working, following the Albanians a little closer. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I imagine, they still have, like most diaspora community, they have this mythical perception of what their country should be and should look like, so they tend to be much more extreme than the locals in a lot of the interpretation of these. So, but I can't say what their position is. I really wasn't looking at that. I was looking more about what the Albanian Americans were doing, which was they were much more active and much more vocal than the Serb community was.
Well, what about from the Albanian side? How would they react to handing over of the area around Mitrovica, which was never a completely Serb area? I mean, the reason that there's a predominance of Serbs there is because they chased the Kosovars out at gunpoint, didn't they?
Well, that was the thing that I was trying to say earlier. So the reason why the Albanian American community suddenly became a focus for Trump, because the only demand they had of the Trump administration is to pivot back to Kosovo and to prevent any swapping of territories. The Trump administration, on the record, said, we have not endorsed that, even though Grenell is being accused of pushing that. It's a different story, the fact that Belgrade and Pristina, meaning Thaci and Vučić, had actually looked for that. So they were against the swapping of any territory. And that's why they considered a victory with this current agreement that had absolutely no swapping of territory whatsoever. And so the ethnic Albanians in Michigan felt that, look, our voice was heard, Trump administration did not include an agreement, therefore we're partners in this.
So they got 2 months to discover that, in effect, the president was deaf and didn't quite hear them properly.
I'm going to let you make those comments, but
Well, I should say, I mean, of course, Fron is very particular to let us all know that he's speaking on his own behalf and not of the McCain Institute.
Yes, thank you.
The distinguished Republican senator.
I just want to, yes, unfortunately, yes. I just want to make sure that it's Fron Nahzi's opinion here.
No, it's almost it's almost like the sort of the Balkan Wars continue. The convolutions are so deep. There's somebody in the 19th century said that the Schleswig-Holstein situation is so complicated, only two people know it, and one of those is mad.
Yes.
And
Yes.
you know, at times this strikes me. How is your mental health, by the way, trying to keep all of these spinning wheels together at the same time?
No, I honestly, like the rest of it, I actually stepped away from it, saying enough, I couldn't take it, and meaning you keep seeing the same play. The only thing that changed were the actors, and you saw the same thing. You saw the same mistakes, and and now more so than ever, you really do see it, that this, you know, illiberal democracy, the growth of populism, the growth. But you always had it in the Balkans, and now it's become sort of the standard way. And and obviously the Balkans have taken a backseat to all these other issues that are going on. Is there, you know, this agreement brought it back to the forefront, but it brought it for the wrong reason. It brought it for not so much to benefit the Balkans, which I think, you know, look, any investment will benefit, but it's going to take a while. They're not going to see anything for a few years. But it does, in the short term, definitely does, maybe we'll have an uptick for the Trump administration. I'm not sure would it have it with the Jewish community, but probably without a doubt with the Albanian Americans. So if he walks away and gets 10,000 plus votes out of this, you know, for a 2-page agreement that includes everything underneath the sun in there, and it's non-binding, you got to give the man credit. It was a good play.
But it comes back to that point I mentioned earlier, is that 10,000 extra votes or 10,000 votes he had in the bag anyway, because Albanians tend to be Republican and right-wing anyway, in many ways.
Right. Well, you do have a large segment also that made it clear that, you know, they're backing Joe Biden. So you do have both sides.
Okay. I didn't.
But it's not, you know, it's not like every single. So I want to make that very clear. This particular group in Michigan has been very loyal to the Republican Party and extremely loyal to Trump. And most of them are small business owners. You know, not, you know, they've always sort of, you know, taken the more extreme hawkish view of things. So that base has been there. And I think with this particular agreement, it's just, let's just say, made it much more appealing for them to support Trump, given everything else. Especially, as I said earlier, the belief that they were responsible for taking the swapping of territory off the convincing Trump and his administration to take that off the agreement. If it's true or not, in today's world, who cares, right?
Yeah, well, the agreement seems to be smoke and mirrors. So which way you point which way you blow the smoke, and which way you point the mirrors at the end of it all, is the determining factor. Have we got any other questions from the floor? We have several other people who've shown interest in these things before. No. So this might produce an election result. This might affect the election results in America. It's not going to cause World War III. Is that a fair justification?
I think that's fair. I really do. I think it's fair.
Yeah. Well, that's a blessing. I mean, we've had one world war and started there definitely, and the other one definitely got an extra impetus, a second stage from the area. And we almost got World War III between the Russians and the others. I think, you know, I remember how tense it was when the Russian tank column rushed into Pristina. If you remember, jumping agreements. This was a serious flashpoint, and then they had to beg for food and fuel off the Allies there. So it was a bit of a blunt gesture. But anybody else? Fron, do you want to draw a conclusion?
Well, the conclusion is this. There's only two things. I mean, look, one is United States needs to stay engaged in the region. It really does. Like it or not, it does push and it solves issues. the problem we're facing is sort of like everybody understands the game now. Everybody understands how lobbyists work. They understand that issues are used for political gain, even in the United States. And Trump has been brilliant in doing that with this. My biggest fear is that the youth, meaning those on the age of 35, have actually become very frustrated with the West, who say, you know, do as we say, not as we do kind of stuff or whatever. And yet they keep seeing the same individuals controlling their countries and taking away their resources. The challenge the United States and Europe is going to face, especially in Kosovo, is that if Albania wins, they're going to have a person who will look, it's not going to be an easy person to deal with. And the challenge will be to make sure how actually are you going to come to some kind of conclusion or some kind of way of solving some of these issues, especially when it comes to minority rights, and finding some final settlement between Serbia and Kosovo. And that's going to be really, really key if we want stability in the region. And to your point, I mean, if, for example, we find an agreement on the Palestine issue, I think tensions will go down very quickly in the entire region. And I think the minute we actually, if we can force somehow Belgrade and Pristina to say, look, you have to sit down and recognize each other, or Serbia has to recognize the issue of Kosovo, I think it would really take a lot off the table, especially as far as the potential World War III or anything like that. But more importantly, actually, it'll probably allow their places to actually start developing. And it would take away these individuals who use the threat of either the Serbs or Albanians to justify their positions while they continue to reap the benefits from the country. So,
okay, that's a mildly optimistic and pragmatic conclusion. Thank you very much, Fron. This is Ian Williams, President of the Foreign Press Association of New York. I've been speaking to Fron Nahzi from the McCain Institute about Kosovo and the multiplexed shadow boxing three-dimensional agreement that we were talking about. Just to let you know, on Thursday, we have another webinar on the future of Broadway. Are the curtains down for Broadway with the COVID epidemic? Next Tuesday, and there's a Kosovo link here as well, we should be talking to Bianca Jagger, but about Nicaragua. Bianca Jagger, some of you may not know, was a major proponent of the Kosovars at the time of the war, and spoke often in support, and of the Bosnians, come to think of it. But she's speaking about her own native country, Nicaragua, and President Ortega, who seems to fit the bill of some of the people that Fron's been talking about in terms of personal integrity. And we have many more, but watch our site, look at the YouTube, refer your friends to it, and come and join the Foreign Press Association if you qualify. And even if you don't, join as an associate. Fron, thanks very much. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. Thank you.
Bye.